Welcome to the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, January 8th. My name is Pam, and let's begin. Lost Year for Education: Global Lessons on How Students Can Rebound by Amy Scott Tyson. As an Afghan boy growing up in a refugee camp in northwestern Pakistan, Ismail Khan remembers his first lesson in the power of education and its disruption. In 1996, when he was in sixth grade, protests by Islamic militants shut down schools and government offices in the area for about 4 months, forcing him and his siblings to stay home. Those kids whose parents were educated kept studying at home and were kind of okay, he recalls. All those kids who did not study for 4 months were struggling and kept struggling for a year or two to get back to the same level. From his formative days in the refugee camp to his years running a school in the war zone of his native Afghanistan to now parenting his own school-aged children in Kent, Washington during the coronavirus pandemic, Mr. Khan's belief in the transformational role of education has stayed with him and has his confidence that students can eventually regain lost ground given the right help. As the pandemic shuts down schools across the globe, warnings about that acute learning losses, the limit of remote schooling, and the cancellation of extracurriculars, coupled with widespread economic hardship, will create a lost generation of youth, particularly in developing countries where child labor persists. Yet Mr. Khan's experience is a reminder that disruptions to education come in many forms, from wars and natural disasters to epidemics. And while these crises have undeniably had negative impact on education, often hitting disadvantaged populations hardest, research also shows that these impacts need not be permanent. Instead, they illustrate how adequate public resources, well directed, can make setback temporary. Planning, as with any contingency, can make a huge difference, says education researchers. A catastrophe, a pandemic, is likely to have a negative impact on outcomes, says Emma Garcia, an education expert at the Left Learning Economic Policy Institute in Washington. Nonetheless, she says, these negative effects can be corrected after a few years if teaching resources are redirected to students who most need them. Coping mechanisms. Indeed, from Afghanistan to Sierra Leone to the United States, there are some reasons for optimism. Not only that students can recover academically, but that they can gain healthy coping mechanisms for future challenges. Your ability to cope with distress, your resilience, your sense of belonging to a community. There are many life skills that kids may have been able to develop, says Dr. Garcia. If kids were able to develop resilience, that is going to be an asset for the rest of their lives and also when they go back to school. Student assessments need to move beyond test scores to capture such skills so that educators can reinforce and leverage students' social and emotional capabilities that may have improved during the pandemic. Resilience, tolerance, understanding, sympathy, creativity, those are assets, she says. Systemic changes. Another overarching lesson is that educational crisis, even those caused by violent regime change, can create opportunities for systemic reform that might not otherwise exist. The post-conflict reconstruction environment offers significant opportunities for policy reform and system change, says a 2005 World Bank report that draws on a database of 52 countries affected by war since 1990. This has been true of the war in Afghanistan. Under the Taliban regime of Islamic fundamentalists from 1996 to 2001, education was severely restricted for females, girls' schools were closed, and madrasas or mosque schools provided most education. In the years after the U.S.-led coalition overthrew the Taliban, school enrollment surged from about 1.2 million students to top 9 million, including more than 3.5 million girls, according to the Afghan Ministry of Higher Education. After returning to Afghanistan in 2001, Mr. Khan in 2003 helped found and later manage a private co-educational school for English and computer skills in the eastern city of Jalalabad that thrived amidst fighting and protest against U.S. forces. After closing earlier this year due to COVID-19, the school, which Mr. Khan's brother runs, is now open. Research suggests that amid the negative disruption of war to society and political institutions, communities that are hungry for change and renewal in education can overcome bureaucratic resistance. In Kosovo, for example, administrative breakdown during 1998-99 war contributed to fairly radical reforms in terms of community involvement in school governance, according to the World Bank report. Ebola and Sierra Leone. Lessons from countries hit by past epidemics are also revealing. Sierra Leone, a country also torn apart by a 1990s civil war, was hit hard in 2014 by Ebola. Children were especially affected. About 20% of Ebola cases were in youths under 15. Thousands of children were orphaned, and schools were closed for about 9 months. Vicky Rameau, a native of Sierra Leone, TV host and education advocate, took part in projects to help students recover lost ground. The big lesson for education from Sierra Leone to the world is that even in a place with a weak educational system like Sierra Leone, students are resilient, says Ms. Rameau, who spent 6 months in Sierra Leone during the current pandemic. One successful initiative during the Ebola school closure, for example, was an educational radio program that was able to reach up to 90% of at-home students. The initiative was reactivated in May when the pandemic forced schools to close again. Accelerated education programs tailored to help struggling students catch up have also seen some success in Sierra Leone. One effort, piloted soon after the Ebola epidemic in 2016, helped 720 girls and boys ages 10 to 16 who were out of school to complete elementary school in just 3 years and pass national primary school exams. The program enrolled many girls who had dropped out or been barred from school by the government after becoming pregnant during the Ebola crisis. Educational rebounds after Katrina. Educational rebounds have also been tracked by researchers following natural disasters such as Hurricane Katrina, which hit New Orleans in 2005. Students affected by Katrina did catch up, although it took nearly 2 full years to make up for the lost instructional time, experts say. A key discovery from Katrina, research shows, is the importance of both ongoing teacher training and matching the most effective teachers with the most vulnerable students during the catch-up period. Indeed, teachers may themselves benefit from an enhanced program of online training during crisis, which will in turn help boost their motivation, experts say. Katrina also showed how correctly matching teachers and students depends on a broad and detailed assessment of where students have fallen behind, coupled with a targeted menu of interventions rather than a cookie-cutter approach, Dr. Garcia says. Helping struggling students could involve steps ranging from an expanded school schedule and summer program to smaller classes, teacher aides and tutors, and counseling, she said. Hopeful signs for some students. Some initial U.S. testing results during the pandemic offer signs of optimism. We found that for the most part, kids were still making gains in both reading and math, says Beth Teraswala, who heads a research team at the Northern Evaluation Association, an Oregon nonprofit focused on student assessments. The study looked at 4.4 million students in grades 3 to 8. Still, Dr. Terasawa cautioned that a higher percentage of children than usual, 25%, were missing from the latest testing sample, and those children were disproportionately students of color, poor performing, and from high poverty schools. While there are signs for optimism, it's still very early, and we have much more to go through in weathering the storm, she says. Research in the U.S. is ongoing, with one national study by online learning company Amplify finding more students in grades K through 5 needing intensive intervention for literacy skills, especially first graders. Mr. Kahn agrees with the concerns and worries that with a full-time job, he lacks adequate time to support his 4 children with online learning. By the time they are in school, I am at work, and when I come back at 7 o'clock, they go to sleep, he says, adding that his wife speaks only limited English. Perhaps what is needed most, he says, is patience by all concerned. They will get back on track, he says, but it will take time. Up next, war in Afghanistan. What has NATO learned from 20 years of fighting? By Anna Maureen Grobe. In Brussels, as America's longest war reaches the 2-decade mark this year, one of President-elect Joe Biden's first orders of business will be figuring out a way forward in Afghanistan, and by extension, a roadmap for NATO's mission in the country. Neither the Taliban nor al-Qaeda is at the top of America's national security threat list anymore, and NATO officials, too, have been clear about their belief that they have bigger fish to fry. In the Alliance's new Strategy 2030 report, Afghanistan is mentioned just 6 times in 40 densely packed pages. The war in Afghanistan is a mission on which the success or failure of NATO was once thought to hinge. In its early days, the war was billed as not only a post-Cold War rebirth of the alliance, but also its 21st century evolution. No longer. The new security agenda, according to the report, will be dominated by competing great powers in which assertive authoritarian states with revisionist foreign policy agendas, in other words, China and Russia, seek to expand their power and influence. Yet as NATO prepares for the next decades, its challenges will be tackled by an alliance transformed, for better or worse, by its experience in Afghanistan and the lessons it has learned there. The question, analysts say, will be whether it chooses to heed them. Habits of cooperation and interoperability. Afghanistan became NATO's marquee mission with the U.S. invasion in 2001, the first time in history that the alliance invoked Article 5, which declares that an attack on one is an attack on all. The NATO-led International Security Assistance Force, or the ISAF, was ultimately composed of allies from 50-plus countries, including non-NATO partners. In the early years of the war, the running joke among U.S. forces, however, was that ISAF stood for I Saw Americans Fight, or I Sunbathed at FOBs, forward operating bases, which are heavily fortified and largely safe. The underlying critique was that some Allied governments used restrictions called caveats to prevent their troops from carrying out night missions, for example, or from deploying to certain more violent parts of the country, and as a result, U.S. and other fighting forces carried a heavier load. Still, the cooperation was a growth experience for the alliance, says Ian Lesser, executive director of the German Marshall Fund in Brussels. These caveats did in some ways hinder the ISAF's ability to operate, but it operated nonetheless and learned a lot by that in terms of habit of cooperation and interoperability that were tested every day. At the same time, the experience transformed the militaries of many NATO member nations. In Germany, some 90,000 troops have deployed to Afghanistan over the years. There's no German general today who doesn't have military or even fighting experience there, says Marcus Kaim, senior fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. The same goes too for a generation of soldiers in Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, and Canada. Member forces grew accustomed to collaborating on intelligence sharing and mission planning that made use of some high-tech systems that many nations wouldn't have been exposed to in peacetime, says Anthony Kordsman, defense analyst at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This, in turn, led to a much better appreciation for Allied capabilities, and it led to an even greater appreciation for allies themselves, including non-NATO partners, many of whom, like Australia and South Korea, took part in the Afghanistan war. If we think about any military engagement of NATO going forward, we'll conceptualize it not as 30 member countries of NATO, but as a loose platform that includes other organizations and non-NATO partners as well, Dr. Kame said. NATO needs partners, he says, because NATO is aware that it can't shy away from deep political changes we're seeing. The NATO 2030 report emphasizes making the bloc a more political alliance, which means making it a place where core security concerns of all sorts are discussed, Dr. Lesser says. The Asian Pacific region, especially China, is a case point. It's a recognition that the definition of what bears on Euro-Atlantic security has expanded tremendously. The right thing to do for NATO. This focus on great power competition, coupled with the varying levels of disenchantment with missions that don't end cleanly, means that the appetite for launching military operations again anytime soon will differ across the alliance. It starts with the question of whether NATO members consider Afghanistan a success. Was it worth all the effort, the blood? Most people would likely answer, not really. And Dr. Kame says, military, an alliance with impressive weapons, uprooted al-Qaeda but did not defeat the Taliban, which, though an effective guerrilla force, was never a highly sophisticated threat. On the nation-building front, you spent an incredible amount of money to achieve remarkably little, Dr. Kordsman said. Yet the definition of success itself reflects the different strategic cultures within NATO. While America is deeply uncomfortable with the notion of not winning, for many NATO allies, analysts say it was enough to show solidarity, to be present, and to make contributions. More broadly, Afghanistan was seen as the price to pay and the right thing to do for NATO in return for the reassurance those countries get from the alliance on the bigger existential threat they face, Dr. Lesser says. The fact that they've been present in Afghanistan is simply part of the insurance policy, and you have to pay these premiums over time. And even as most members came out of their Afghan experience more cautious about exporting democracy, the 2030 report acknowledges it also argues that it's nonetheless vital that NATO doesn't allow democratic erosion. The cause and cost of corruption. For this to happen, NATO must take some key lessons of Afghanistan, including the corrosive effect of corruption and the way in which the U.S. and its NATO allies may inadvertently encourage it, says retired Colonel John Agolia, former director of both the U.S. Army's Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute and the Counterinsurgency Training Center, Afghanistan, both in Kabul. The billions of free-flowing Western dollars that flooded into Afghanistan after the invasion made graft and fraud easy and commonplace. We need to understand how we put money into an environment, who we're giving it to, and what are the oversight mechanisms. What could be the second and third order impacts? Corruption undermined the legitimacy of the Afghan government, reduced its effectiveness, and created a source of resentment for its own population, which in turn drove Taliban recruitment and made it much more difficult for NATO to achieve its key mission goals, from security to effective governance. Carolina McLaughlin, policy officer at Transparency International in London, wrote in a NATO review. At the same time, in bolstering some former Soviet republic to help resist Russian democratic undercutting and influence as in Afghanistan, we may have to deal with some people who have blood on their hands, some who are corrupt, some who are trying to reform. Colonel Agolia says, we've learned a lot about understanding the limits of power, how to shape it at its best you can, and how to take what you can get. And it's not always going to look pretty. I get the great power competition, but it's won and lost in the trenches doing these things. So that if you actually do have to go into combat, he adds, you own the day. This next article, titled In Remote Hilltop Town, New Pride in a Biblical Empire, by Taylor Luck. Busara, Jordan. The unusual yet familiar name is etched in Arabic on an imposing, blinding white limestone archway at the entrance to the sleepy town, a welcome sign from millennia ago, capital of Eden. A passerby stops to reassure a wayward visitor. You're in the right place, he says, gesturing to the arch. Welcome to the land of Eden. Mentioned in the Bible and other Jewish texts by Egyptian pharaohs and Roman historians, the Edomites ruled a closely guarded empire 3,000 years ago in southern Arabia and the southwestern Levant, from mountainside fortresses and a fortified wall capital city, Basra. Here in modern day Busayra, a small farming town in southern Jordan, built on and around the Iron Age Edomite capital, residents are anxious to welcome the world and share their Edomite heritage. It's more than a tourism opportunity. It's a matter of civic pride. Yet despite being just an hour's drive on a direct road from the famed rock-carved Nabataean city of Petra, which drew 1 million visitors in 2019, few tourists have come to Eden. The only traffic to this town of 10,000 people are dented fruit and vegetable pickup trucks chugging up from the Jordan Valley and nearby orchards. The area is famous for apples and guava, not empires. Plans are afoot to change that, though the first hurdle was local education. Sustainable heritage. Not many years ago, local residents knew little of the origin of the rock piles, stone walls, and pottery shared that poked out between homes and littered the hillside town. Even fewer knew exactly where were the hilltop remains of what is now known to be the heart of the ancient capital, a site shared with the local boys' school. I used to play in the site, but I didn't know what it was, says Safa Faris Hamed Al-Rouf, director and co-founder of the Busayra Foundation for Cultural Heritage, who grew up across the street from the remains of the Edomite ruling palace. I heard it was built by the Edomites, but I had no idea who they were or what was inside. In 2014, the U.S. Agency for International Development and the American Center of Oriental Research teamed up with the community activists to raise local awareness of the Edomite site importance as part of the Sustainable Cultural Heritage through engagement of local communities project, or the SHEP, S-C-H-E-P. USAID SHEP organized residents to improve the site's presentation and management and run activities in schools and other events teaching the site's histories to other residents. Signage and paths were developed to guide visitors through the foundations and walls of the Edomite palace, temple, baths, a meandering market, and city gates, which stand at the highest peak in the town. From this hilltop town overlooking wind-swept plains of wheat, olive groves, and guava trees, the Edomites ruled as early as the 13th century BC. At the civilization's peak in the 8th century BC, some archaeologists estimate as many as 1 million Edomites lived in Basra and its surrounding villages. Edomites leveraged their capital city's position at the midway point of the King's Highway, still used today as Jordan's Route 35, an ancient caravan route that ran from the Red Sea north to Damascus and beyond. The crossroads for trade between ancient Egypt, the Mediterranean, Babylonia, the Red Sea, and Arabia made Edom the beating heart of Iron Age globalization. From here, they controlled the trade of incense from interior Arabia, glass and papyrus from Egypt, Edomite copper, medicinal herbs from the north, and reportedly silk as far away as India. Newfound passion. Today, Busayra residents have become passionate cheerleaders for the history and archaeology, ready with a sports fan's fervor to discuss the Edomites' greatness at a moment's notice. People talk about the Nabetans and the Romans as civilizations, but no one hears much about the Edomites, who were an empire, and they only lived right here. Khalad Saoud, a resident who works in ecotourism, says he leans down and pats the ground with his hand. We have to get visitors to see this for themselves. There were millions of people living on this soil 3,000 years ago, says Ibram Rifari, carrying groceries through the modern Edom city gate. We are walking on the foundations of a great civilization. The Iron Age was a period of great civilizations. Ammon, Moab, Babylon, says Mr. Arof, who is completing her master's dissertation on Basra site. And the Edomites were among the strongest of them all. Now there's a sense in our community that we are home to a great civilization, and everyone wants to share it. To raise Becerra's profile and continue conservation work, Ms. Aruf and others began promoting Edom and the range of Byzantine and Islamic sites later built upon its foundations to Jordanians and the wider world. While COVID-19 has put tourist travel to Jordan on hold, Becerra residents have been hard at work creating experiences to welcome visitors once it returns. Cooking classes. One initiative is the Edom Trail running past the sites in the city, and a second, longer 7-kilometer trail winding down the jagged valley below to the imposing honeycomb rock-cut Edomite fortress of Selah. The Becerra Foundation has trained local residents to create pottery modeled off of shards found here. Visitors will be able to take mosaic workshops and a cooking class to learn and make regaga, a local staple made of wheat dough strips, yogurt, and lentils, ingredients available to the Edomites. Yet much is left to be learned from the site itself, and questions remain unanswered, such as the Edomites' fate. Several archaeologists believe Edom never recovered from the Babylonians' sacked Basra in the 6th century BC, leading to the Nabetans to claim much of their empire in the 4th century BC. Edomites slowly migrated to Wadi Araba and the Negev of southwest Judea, where some say they produced historical figures such as Herod the Great, melded with the local population, and then disappeared from the historical record. With centuries of migration between the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula, it is impossible to say whether Becerra's residents are the Edomites' direct descendants, but they insist it is their inheritance, and one they will share with all. The Edomites left this as our inheritance, and the best way to protect this 3,000-year-old treasure is to share it, says Yasin Fala, a volunteer who now serves as the Foundation's program manager. Our doors are open, our food is ready, our buildings are ready, and soon the coronavirus pandemic lessens and people can come. Eden is open again. Well, friends, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, January 8th. This is Pam, thanking you for inviting me into your home. Please stay safe, be blessed. Make it a great day.